Okay, so that works.
Perfect.
Okay, sorry about that. All right, so I'm trained as a social historian at Cambridge, where I worked on social mobility using autobiographical texts as sources for my doctoral dissertation. I became interested in autobiography itself as a kind of personal speech act, specifically a kind of I statement that might be indicative of personality and the idea of self, which I didn't really understand at the time, but I've come to think about a lot in the course of my career since then. This was in the mid 1980s. My dissertation argued that the absence of a plot or intrigue centered on a single protagonist or social agent in narrative discourse would correlate with the absence of a culture of individualized intergenerational social mobility, the sort that emerged in the social theory of the mid 20th century. And it was being worked on in Cambridge with the Cambridge Group for the Study of Society or Social Structure and Society at that time. Um, Today, I'm no longer so confident about the conclusion that I drew there. I think that the culture of early modern autobiography that I drew upon, a random sample pulled from inventories, lists of English diaries and autobiographies, was a really actually kind of narrow sample of autobiographers that was uh, too many English religious nonconformists who had a very, I think, special or unique way of thinking about themselves. Even despite the fact that that was the kind of culture that Weber drew on in thinking about the Protestant ethic and the spirit of capitalism. At any rate, that work got me interested in the culture of autobiographical discourse. Um, and my getting hired in at Berkeley in a department of rhetoric, which emerged at that time in the early 90s as really a department of critical theory, rather than social history or even literature, which would be the two areas that I might have worked in if I was interested in ego documents, led to my 1996 book on English narrative discourse in the first person as a source of the self, as the philosopher Charles Taylor would have put it. I conceived of it as a response to the work of the historical anthropologist Alan McFarlane's 1978 book, The Origins of English Individualism, in which he claimed that as far back as the 14th century, Englishmen were rampant individualists, as he said, on the evidence of records of property ownership and transfer. Feet of fines is what he was looking at. And he was really talking about the pre-Renaissance area, late medieval, and yet you can see on the cover of his book is an image of Robinson Crusoe. So there was a kind of an anachronism, I think, built into his thinking about it, even at the time. My book argued to the contrary that while early modern English proprietors may have appeared to have acted like modern individualists, their self-concept was organized differently. And this is where I introduced the idea of self-identity and self to the study of autobiography at the time. It hadn't been done prior to that. Um, on the evidence of their autobiographical practice, they didn't identify themselves as autonomous, self-possessed social and economic agents. And this depended on my view of the form of the autobiography, not really so much its content, although I was paying attention to that too. Their stories were not about authentic individuals, but rather mirrors or patterns of traditional sorts or types. And this was true for what might be now looked at as secular autobiographies, but in the nature of the culture at the time, it was pretty much informed by um, religious discourse, specifically Protestant. And so even what might be thought of as secular or non-religious autobiographical writing reflected that pattern and traditional view. This changed with the advent of the novel in the 18th century and the cultivation of the social hero who overcomes unique challenges. A figure like Robinson Crusoe, but in my view, really didn't come into its own until the figure of Jane Eyre in the mid 19th century. Those of you who know Charlotte Bronte's novel know that it's subtitled An Autobiography. And at that point, in my mind, where art imitated life, and actually a novel was calling itself an autobiography, a kind of tipping point had been reached in the culture. So in my book, though, the first English individualist as an autobiographer was the London bookseller James Lackington, who published his autobiography in 1791. And again, forgive me if this is all familiar to you, because you know this work. I still see that many people do not. The publication of Origins of the Individual Self introduced me to the work of other European cultural and social historians working on autobiography in the 17th, 18th, and 19th century. In particular, Rudolf Dekker and Arjan Bogerman, then at Erasmus University Rotterdam and the University of Amsterdam. And this is, again, this may be familiar to you. This is the website that they had set up in the late 1990s that they maintained for some time, which contained Rudolph's inventory of Dutch ego documents from 1500 to 1814, and Arjan's group research project, Controlling Time and Shaping the Self, which was focused on Dutch ego documents from 1750 to 1914. That was funded by the Netherlands Organization for Scientific Research. And I have to say that being out west here in California, we don't have the benefit of large research group funded projects that facilitate collaboration on large kinds of projects that the Europeans do. It's really, I mean, out here on the Pacific Rim, I feel a little bit isolated from the energy that I always feel is happening around European research in this area. Since the year 1989, the center has generated many conferences and book publications. Again, I'm sure many of you have participated in them, or at least know of them. And their book publications are many, which include single essays, collections of conference papers, and scholarly monographs. Here are two books that I have contributed to working on, or some of my research that followed upon the origins of the individual self. In particular, the work of, or the journal of John Wesley, which I've been thinking about for several decades now, and not really done anything major with until, well, I'm still not sure if I'm going to do that, but at any rate, these are just a few of several books. In 2008, Arjan, Rudolph, and I began co-editing the Brill book series, Egodocuments in History. The series has issued 12 volumes to date, and I think that there are 2 more in press, but I'm not actually sure at this point. In the past year, Rudolph and Arjan stepped down, as many of you know, and Michael Green, our seminar series convener, has joined me as the current series co-editor, and I'm very grateful to have Michael's energy and focus on the editorial group with me now, because we need it. Rudolph was, as I'm sure all of you know, a major networker and just a source of incredible energy on this topic. So the seminar itself and this inaugural lecture is really Michael's idea. and I'm really grateful for the opportunity to meet you and talk with you about it. And I hope that it'll help the Ego Documents in History series remain robust and expand its reach in time and space. Our publications thus far have been Eurocentric and early modern focused. I would like to see it expand even beyond Europe, and also try to connect us with the present, if at all possible, so that we could have more comprehensive coverage of ego documentation. I'll say a little bit, again, you may know this already, so forgive me for wasting your time here, but the term ego document was coined in 1958 by the Dutch historian Jacques Presser, and it was taken up in the 1990s by German scholars and has since spread, chiefly among social scientists, especially historians who value ego documents as primary sources of research data. Ego documents comprise a broad range of documents in a vast array of media, verbal and nonverbal, authored and unauthored, referring to individual and collective activity and experience. In this regard, they include, but also extend beyond texts identified by literary scholars as representations or other forms of personal life writing, such as biography, autobiography, journal, or diary, and the more recent written variations such as autofiction and auto theory, which some of you may know, but I mean, there are just some of other forms that are multimedia in nature, beyond writing. While acknowledging the potential value and meaning of specific ego documents as symbolic forms, the majority of social scientific researchers utilizing ego documents, myself included, typically avoid describing and interpreting them as works of art. Ego documents provide evidence of the condition and quality of individual life and pastimes, for instance, how people spent their time and what they aspire to do. When studied in groups and comparatively, they also provide evidence of knowledge and power within collectives or collectivities. Today, I'll give you a rough sketch of a book project I've recently conceived that's focused on understanding the early modern English diary as a cultural practice. It came out of an essay I recently wrote for the Routledge Companion to John Wesley, again, thinking now the third time about John Wesley, on the journal as an object and an utterance of early Methodist discourse. The journal was a printed religious society newsletter that was presented as the extract of a personal journal maintained as a daily chronicle. There were 21 printed extracts that appeared in just over 50 years. And this is an example of an early one. This is, I think, the second version, the second issue of the 21 parts. It didn't begin as a planned newsletter. It was originally intervention in a controversy in which Wesley thought it expedient to present, as it were, a kind of actuality of his own experience, not necessarily religious experience, but rather his work as an evangelist in the colony of Georgia in the New World. But he continued it throughout the course of his life because it seemed to be a good way of gathering people who were interested in his particular approach to religion. The journal represents a unique document of calendar time from its first date in print, 14 October 1735 to 24 October 1790. Every day is accounted for in the printed journal. But there was no actual journal document from which the printed work was extracted. The printed work was the journal. It was fabricated up from a bunch of different sources that Wesley kept or utilized to sort of situate himself within the broad field of English culture and society at the time. As many of you probably know, he was an itinerant preacher working outside, literally, the English church, but upholding church liturgy and so forth, with the exception of being outside. Um, and he was recruiting people who were not normally going to church at the time, but Wesley felt needed religious discipline. And the idea of the journal itself became the basis of what was called Methodism. He focused on diary practice or self exercises, religious exercises, but also personal disciplinary exercises that supported community entrepreneurship in economic work and so forth. That was unique at the time. Um, and the journal in print sort of fostered habits of being. And some of you may be reading that first entry for September 6th, 1741 there, that sort of helped meld Methodism as a religious society. It's very important to think about it as a society rather than a church in the old Protestant way. I think of this as a kind of way of, if some of you are familiar with the work of the Southeast Asian Studies anthropologist, recently deceased Benedict Anderson, the brother of Perry Anderson. He thinks of the printing press as a way of, especially newspapers, as a way of fostering the idea of an abstract community that's perhaps distributed in space and time, but is held together by their relationship to each other as a kind of virtual community that is instantiated by the newspaper's daily record of the calendar. One could locate oneself in space and time through the newspaper. This is a fairly commonplace idea now, but it hadn't been applied to Methodism. What's interesting is that Wesley did keep a diary, but it was used partly to create the journal, but it was nothing like the printed extract series, as you can tell from this sample page from 1734. In his early diary practice while he was a student at Oxford, Wesley's diary functioned like a physical exercise logbook for spiritual strength training, which employed a nuanced coded system to track the frequency, duration, intensity, and form of his devotional exercises: meditation, prayer, self-examination, and so forth, including conversation with other religious devotees that were gathered around him at that time in Oxford. He used a shorthand and a personal cipher to record information about his spiritual exercises. And he did that not to be secret, but rather to save time, because he was intent on putting all of his time into his worship and so forth. He recorded his personal activities routinely twice and sometimes 3 times during his waking hours, creating a detailed record of daily expenditure of time every day from 4 or 5 a.m. to 9 or 10 p.m. and under several heads, which are tagged as study, prayer, talk, writing, Bible, meditation. Each noted, and some of these notations on the right-hand side there indicate in his cipher the quality of his attention to these exercises as they went across the day. He recorded these things in hourly phases, but occasionally they were divided into half or quarter hour intervals. In general, this is kind of I mean, it's not unfamiliar, but it's an underemphasized aspect of diary practice in the early modern period. The diary isn't a mode of self-expression. It's a piece of technical equipment utilizing an operational code that wasn't intended for confession, testimony, or memory. or really the focus of whatever we might call a self of expressive romantic, let's call it literary um, uh, focus. It was a tool for the regulation of cognition toward attainment of concord with God. It was an instrument of self-organization, and that's how I get to the topic of sovereignty in particular. Um, it helped me uh, connect with an idea that had already been practiced or published by Philippe Lejeune in a 2009 essay on a little-known 19th century French educator, Marc-Antoine Jullien. Um, uh, the realization helped me to understand the essay that I am now working on sovereignty. That will be forthcoming in the Oxford Companion to Restoration Literature on restoration autobiography. Lejeune says in speaking about Jullien's essay on a method aiming at improving the use of time and the best way to be happy, when surveying the evolution of the diary from antiquity to the present, one becomes aware that it derives from the models of administrative control and commercial management. Each of us has become a state in miniature with its government, its legal department, and its archives. Perhaps today the self is the state. This is interesting to me. After the execution of Charles I by Parliament in 1649, the so-called Restoration era begins with the crowning of his firstborn son, Charles Stuart, as Charles II in 1660, which ended a difficult decade of unsuccessful experimentation in republican government without a monarch. The era is thought to extend to 1688, when James Stuart II, brother to Charles II, abandoned the throne, which he ascended to upon the death of Charles in 1685. And that began the Glorious Revolution in England, which I'm sure most of you know through political history. It was a big moment for the advancement of the Republican state, in which the monarch rules by the consent of the people. I mean, that didn't happen overnight, but with the help of Lockean ideas, the two treatises on government and the essay concerning human understanding, a notion was advanced about the citizen subject as a kind of sovereign whose consent actually allows the monarch to be the sovereign and for the government to be legitimated through a process. The 28-year period of Stuart rule in England that led up to the Glorious Revolution of 1688 was racked by political distrust and personal insecurity as the Stuarts attempted to restore public order at home while waging a most constant war with their European neighbors, especially the Dutch. Home rule was attempted by imposing uniformity on their subjects' worship of the Church of England, which was the foundation of the monarch's divine right to rule. So there was no republican system yet. There was kind of like a haphazard attempt to go back to the old way on the part of the monarchs. But having had the taste of parliamentary rule, even in its disorder, many active English subjects were suspicious, let's put it that way, of these monarchs and monarchy in general. All adult males were required by law in the Restoration period, a series of acts known as the Clarendon Code, after the prime minister who imposed them, to attend services and subscribe in church and subscribe to the Book of Common Prayer. Failure to subscribe resulted in excommunication and ejection from all public office. And in a way, life itself depended upon your matters of conscience in following the rule of law. 2,000 ordained ministers lost their church livings at the time, and others in other parts of government had to stand down as well. This compounded the cynically imposed uniformity in church or it was rather compounded by government censorship of the press, the licensing of all books, and the restriction of newspapers to one government weekly, which reported almost no domestic news. English subjects feared monarchical absolutism, yet the late Stuart kings, who were rumored to be Catholic and thus hypocritical enforcers of church uniformity in the Book of Common Prayer and state religion, they feared their subjects' recent experience of life without a sovereign. So the Restoration era was a period of distrust and paranoia all around. What's interesting to me, though, in trying to figure out what to say about Restoration autobiography, was that this was the time of a vast expansion in diary keeping. There exist as many such documents in English from the period 1660 to 1699 as from all the centuries preceding them combined. The number is about 200. So 200 before 1660 and 200 in just those 4 decades after it. And in addition to that, the Restoration is the historical era of the 2 most famous diaries in English, which are monuments of English heritage: the Diary of Samuel Pepys, which spans 1660 to 1669, and the Diary of John Evelyn, from 1640 until his death in 1706. How to explain the sudden small explosion of diaries, which is the most singular fact about Restoration autobiography? For me, a need for what I call personal intelligence and self-regulation in public life under the later Stuart monarchs, because of their oppressive oaths and vigilant magistrates who were enforcing this conformity, created a dearth of public information and suspicion, which required the personal accountability and conscience because of let's say, uncertainty. As I understand it, the Restoration Diary was a personal project, and the diarist, him or herself, as a self-organized and self-authorized projection of personal, political, social, and cultural agency, the sovereign of an individually delimited realm of empirical knowledge and experience. In time outside the period of which this essay is concerned, the rules and methods of intelligence gathering, accounting, rectifying, and inscribing and archiving practiced in Restoration diaries would be recognized and described as techniques of the modern sovereign subject, the citizen constituent of modern governmentality, as Foucault has described it. And it's from Foucault that Lejeune gets his idea that after Marc-Antoine Julien, perhaps today the self is the state. So if we think of this idea of the sovereign self, or not even the self at all, but rather just an idea of personal sovereignty and coherence and agency, we can trace it back. We might trace it back. I mean, this is a largely speculative essay, to this period of innovation and so forth. So I'm citing here the sole work of let's say, journal and diary theory from 1656, which is about a Christian diary. But Christians at that time were political subjects more than just religious subjects. And as you can see, Beadle himself acknowledges the various kinds of journals, diaries, and account books that already existed as a common practice at that time. So there were probably much more than 200 such works in the period. Most of them were, ephemeral texts that were destroyed. We really have now only those which managed to be kept in archives, mostly family archives, especially, well, in the case of Pepys, he endowed his library with his diary to Magdalen College, Cambridge, and John Evelyn stayed at his family's country house, which still is in the Evelyn family even today, over many centuries. Other works are much more accidental and hard to come by, but are still indicative of that time. Okay, I'm already getting to close to 40 minutes. So that's what I actually figured for time, and I don't want to keep you too long. What I had wanted to do was to actually spend some time looking at different examples from these texts, but the kind of close reading that's there is time consuming and perhaps too esoteric. But we can have questions about that or discuss it in general when I'm done. I know that I'm making a rather large claim here, and I haven't presented much evidence, but it really does lead us down into the weeds. The last slide I'll show you is just the shortest of many examples of from the diary of Philip Henry, who was a nonconformist minister who kept a diary starting when he was in his 20s in 1653 through his death in 1704. I went through and collected a bunch of examples of diaries that actually noted the coronation of King Charles in 1661. I thought, what better way to thematize sovereignty in diaries than by looking at the way in which diaries recorded the crowning of the king, which also to me was a form of consent. If these people, such as Philip Henry, wouldn't swear an oath to uphold the Book of Prayer in church and lost their jobs as a result, they nevertheless acknowledged the fact of the king, because it didn't necessarily, the rule of the monarch didn't necessarily interfere with their matters of conscience before God in the church. And so there is a complicated, let's say, mentality of governmentality of the self that is played out in the course of Restoration in England, where many loyal subjects upheld the monarchy, but were excluded from political life because in matters of church, they had a sense of conscience that couldn't allow them to go forward, because before God, they had to respond for themselves, and putting the king before God was just problematic for them. So what really happens, I guess, at this time, and I'll just say this to conclude, I'm reading now from a paragraph of my essay. The rational, conscientious, and credible citizen witness who had a serious vested interest in social order and political stability was indispensable to the political authority of the Restoration sovereign and the good governance of his state institutions. The common subject's personal integrity, intention, and capacity for active participation in public and private business affairs, in short, his self-governance, legitimated not only state authorities, but also national projects, prosperity, and security. Charles II's coronation day in 1661 was a starting point of the Restoration citizens' movement toward the liberal public Republican governmentality that emerged in the Glorious Revolution of 1688. Symbolically, according to tradition, the coronation event was an occasion for the swearing of oaths certifying the noble subject's loyalty and obedience to the monarch, and the monarch's promise to protect and serve his noble subjects' common capacities and agency. The additional remote voluntary participation of common citizens observers of this solemn national event was a sign of politics in time to come. And the diary was essential to that future time that is marked by, for example, Foucault and Lejeune in their study of governmentality and the role of, let's say, self-governance through diary practices. So thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Michael. I think it was fascinating and also very rich, both in scope and in time, also time frame. And thank you also for mentioning the work of Rudolf and Ariane. It's a pity that neither of them joined us, but Ariane Bacherman and Rudolf Decker are actually going to join the conference that Hadrian Cichanowski, my colleague from Toruń, entire organizing in March. So I
Right.
think we can have very brief round of questions because we are a little bit in delay because of some technical issues, but we also have Alessandra Giliberto from Brill who will have some words about the Brill series. So questions, if you have any questions to Michael. You can just open your microphone and speak.
Yeah, go ahead. Anybody? I see hands, but
Professor Roszak.
So, yes, my question is linked with problem of this war, pre-war and after-war period, because it's a very well-known situation in Polish literature that the war period, for example, so-called deluge in the 17th century, just in the middle of the 17th century, it was a how can we describe it, as a boost of these diaries produced by mercenaries, many persons involved into this war. How does it look like in this English situation? As I mean, this war period and this restoration period. Can we assess maybe the number of these diaries, or against the background of this pre-war period and I mean this restoration period? Yes, it's my first question.
I think one of the interesting things about diaries in the English period, in the 17th century in general, is that they're often called journals, and not diaries. They're chronicle-like, but that seems to be the form that what we might call, I don't know, commercial information. For example, about the movement of troops in wartime, about the fortunes of, let's say, ships carrying goods on the seas where piracy exists, not just warfare. And certainly in England, a figure like Samuel Pepys kept a copious diary, partly because he was a naval administrator and needed intelligence on shipping at the time. Not just the Navy fighting wars with the Dutch or whomever, but also commercial shipping as well. So I would say that in the 17th century, a lot of the diaries that exist are really ways of small groups of people, or even single individuals, gathering intelligence about movements of various goods and services, let's say, some of them military, some of them mercantile. So that, and related information to that, rather than, and I suppose other political happenings like the rise and fall of individual ministers or other civil servants, rather than preoccupations on a personal level with matters of what we might call aesthetic interest. That's my personal view. I think that we've overread works like Pepys's. I mean, that's a unusual. I mean, I'm sure all of you are aware of Pepys and have read some parts of his work. It's unusually expressive, and yet it's very practical in its nature, in spite of the way it reveals, let's say, a unique personality. There's been too much attention on that. If you see Pepys against the backdrop of more mundane works that are concerned with matters of the movement of troops, and sometimes they're just copied straight out of the newsletters of the day, they look much more banal or mundane, in my view.
Thank you very much. And I see that François Joseph has also a question or a comment.
Yes, yes. Thank you very much for this this presentation. And I would like to say how influential were the books and articles from Professor Mascuch when the French group launched in the 90s its reflection on Egodocument and on personal writings. But I have a question on on the fascinating presentation he made about the end of the English Revolution, the Restoration. Did you make comparison with the French situation at the end of the 16th century and beginning and the 17th century, at the end of the War of Religion, when exactly the same kinds of dynamics as played in order to create, in order to encourage the affirmation of a sovereign self, as in Montaigne, for example.
Yeah. Because I hadn't actually, I mean, at this moment, literally, I'm thinking about trying to develop this as a book project. It really was just an essay for a companion to restoration literature. And I was really, my job was to write about Samuel Pepys, really. And I failed to fulfill my responsibility. I just got interested in the broader context. And so I haven't done the work of actually comparing it beyond the Restoration period in England, but in a casual way, I think that it's possible to actually find connections to earlier and later periods beyond England if I were to do it systematically. I'm sort of, I don't know what to say anymore about this idea of the self that that a lot of literature students like to emphasize. Self-writing, life writing. I'm not really sure what early modern concepts of self were like, and I'm much more interested in the practice of a daily form of intelligence gathering, really. And the diary book is being something like that. And it seems, okay, yes, Montaigne, you know, I mean, he retires and moves to his country estate and he becomes reflective in a way that does seem self-expressive, yet retains that practical advice book kind of focus in his work. So there will be obviously outliers, and I wouldn't say that there is, that this idea that I have extends to all ego documents of this sort that are chronicles rather than, let's say, narratives from the period, the early modern period. But I do think it probably is likely to cover many, if not the majority of them, in a very general sense. Thanks for that question.
Thank
Thanks
you
for the
very
other
much.
question as well.
Thank you. Any more questions? I think we have time for one more short question.
I'll be short in answering it. Sorry about the delay getting started.
No, it's not a problem. It's also first time, and I think for a lot of people, it's the first time that they use this Teams, so it was expected. Well, I think that then we will thank you once again for the great lecture. The lecture has been recorded, and we will discuss with you, Michael, if we can publish it online, but that will be done separately. Not without your permission.
No worries. There's all kinds of things out there.
No. But we didn't talk about it from the beginning. That's why I'm just mentioning, because you probably see it. But now I will stop the recording, and